Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We are so delighted that you're able to join us. My name is David Bulova and I am a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and it is my honor to be able to serve as the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. For those of you who are not familiar with the commission, we are a legislative advisory body created 40 years ago to coordinate federal and state law and policy focused on the restoration and protection of the Chesapeake Bay. And in fact, we actually predate the original Chesapeake Bay Agreement. Today, our role is more important than ever, since restoration of the Bay ultimately relies on our state legislators adopting policies and then funding these efforts through our respective state budgets. Currently, the commission is made up of 21 members from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. But while our primary focus is on these three states, we also often partner with all 6 states as well as the District of Columbia in order to be able to get our work done. One of the beauties of our commission is its diversity. We have members who hail from the far northern reaches of the watershed to the southern mouth of the Bay. We represent urban, suburban, and rural constituencies. And while we are elected as Democrats and Republicans, we leave partisanship at the door as we try to work to solve extremely complex issues. One of my favorite parts about the commission are actually getting out into our respective states. And so every one of our meetings involves some kind of field trip. And one of the things that I do love the most is visiting each other's state capitals and learning about their legislative processes. And while there's a lot of similarities, there are some real big notable differences. Many of those differences go all the way back to colonial times and have continued to evolve over hundreds of years. And so, for instance, the Commonwealth of Virginia just celebrated 400 years of representative democracy starting in 1619. A couple of years ago, we started to ask ourselves, what are these fundamental differences? And more importantly, what are the implications for today's legislative world as we strive to restore and protect the Chesapeake Bay? To answer this question, Ann Swanson, our executive director, partnered with Molly Brown with the Chesapeake Legal Alliance to give a presentation to our commission at our meeting in Gettysburg in 2019. And you know what? The differences really do matter. They don't matter with respect to our ultimate goals. We're all committed to restoring the Chesapeake Bay. But it does mean that each of our states has to approach these issues differently in order to actually make these changes and achieve these goals in the long term. And I think what was more exciting about this presentation is that it actually opened up a conversation among our members, and members were excited to share how their legislative processes worked and how these differences manifested themselves with respect to the decision-making process. And so it really was a celebration of what makes our states unique, as well as what binds us together and how we can work better together in order to achieve our common goals. The only downside to that presentation was that we were in a small room in Gettysburg with only about 10 outside participants. So even then, we knew that it was too important of a conversation not to open up to a larger audience. And so I am so pleased that today we are going to rectify that. And we're able to bring the presentation to a much larger audience and to record it so that it can be shared with others. Also, please know that we have prepared a summary of the structural differences among our states, actually 1 state and 2 commonwealths. So you don't have to take notes unless you want to, but we will send out that cheat sheet at the conclusion of the webinar. So now I'd like to make a couple of introductions. Our featured speaker is Molly Brown. And so Molly Brown is a senior attorney and the director of community legal education from the Chesapeake Legal Alliance. And I just want to say, without Molly's work, this presentation would not have been possible. She's done a great job of being able to distill these differences and put them together in a way that's meaningful and evokes conversation. Following each part of Molly's presentation, we're going to pause to reflect on how those differences affect the work of our state legislators. And so a bit of a roundtable and hopefully some impromptu discussion about how these differences really affect the decision-making process. Facilitating that discussion will be Senator Scott Martin. And so Senator Martin is a commissioner from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he hails from the lower Susquehanna watershed area. Offering insight from Maryland will be Senator Sarah Elfreth. Senator Elfreth represents the Annapolis region and the Severn and Southern Rivers watersheds. And then I will join in to offer some reflections from a Commonwealth of Virginia point of view. And I represent the city of Fairfax and central parts of Fairfax County. And my watershed address is the Pohick Creek, which flows to the middle Potomac River. And so Molly, without further ado, I just want to thank you so much for your commitment to this partnership and for all that you've done to work with the Chesapeake Bay Commission. We are really looking forward to your presentation and to the conversation.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Chairman Bulova. Before we go ahead and get started, I wanted to run through a few logistics, and some of them are going to echo what you heard in the introduction. As Chairman Bulova mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link to all the people who registered for it. We will also be posting the link to the video both on the Commission's and CLA's websites. So if you know someone who is unable to attend today that would be interested in the information, it will be available for you later. We want this to be as informative for you as possible. So please ask your questions as they arise with the question button located in the bottom of your screen right there. And also, you got to hear a little bit about us. We're going to be taking a couple of polls at the beginning of the presentation to learn more about who's in our audience, who we're speaking with today. So in order to participate in those polls, you can use your cell phone, or you can open up another window on your computer's browser and go to slido.com. And I'll give you further instructions when we get there. So here's the first poll that we would like you to answer. If you're using your smartphone, you can simply open up your camera and scan this barcode that's located on the screen, and then press the option to open up your internet browser when it pops up. And that way you can enter your answer to the question right into your phone. Alternatively, if you visit slido.com and enter the poll number, which is 288956, you'll be able to answer the question as well. So I'm going to leave this open for just a minute so that everyone has the opportunity to figure this out and respond. All right, so it looks like we have many people from Maryland, but we also have a good spread from Virginia and DC, Pennsylvania, Delaware. We have people from New York. No one from West Virginia. All right, fantastic. All right, thank you for participating in that. Now you shouldn't have to change anything. When I go to the next slide, it should change on your browser or on your phone automatically. In which sector do you work, or did you work if you're retired or have moved on from the watershed-based work that you used to do? All right, so it looks like we have a majority of NGO nonprofits with a good representation from government. And I understand that they didn't make it into the poll, but there are also those of you who are in the education sector as well. And I apologize if that's not available to you as an option. Okay, fantastic. And then the last question we'd like to ask you is, what is your favorite Chesapeake Bay watershed food? We couldn't include everything on the list, but we tried to hit the highlights from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. So crabs and oysters, the seafood. Turkey Hill ice cream is up there too. Oh. All right, fantastic. Well, I'll thank you so much for participating in those. It gives us just a little bit of an insight into who we're speaking with today. So that brings us to why we're here today. If you live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, if you do the work related to or interested in local water quality issues, if you are involved personally or professionally in restoring and maintaining the health of the Chesapeake Bay and the communities within the watershed, you know that this work is not a single jurisdiction effort. It really does take the proverbial village. So our goal here today is to highlight some of the differences between three of our Bay watershed jurisdictions, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And as Chairman Bulova mentioned earlier, to have a real discussion about how those differences affect the work that elected officials do in each of those jurisdictions, as well as the work that they do together as part of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. The hope is that by having a better understanding of the geographic, demographic, and political structures of each, that we'll all better be able to leverage those differences and use them to work more easily and more effectively towards our common goal, which is a clean, healthy Chesapeake Bay watershed. So here's the roadmap for today. We're going to start with an overview of state geography and demographics. We're then going to move on to an overview of what the General Assemblies for each look like. We're going to talk about the legislative procedure for each, and then we are going to touch on the budget process briefly. And then we're going to take questions and takeaways at the end. I want to emphasize that I am not the subject matter expert present on this presentation. So while I hope that you do gain something from the information that I'm going to show you, the really interesting parts of today's presentation are going to come from listening to our elected officials discussing how these differences that I'm going to lay out affect and influence the work that they do and the work that, that their colleagues do as well. So again, please ask your questions as we go. If we don't have time to address them during the breaks of each section, we'll try to cover them all at the end. And with that, let's get started. State geography and demographics overview. Let's start with the size of each state that we're looking at. Maryland is approximately 12,400 square miles. Pennsylvania, 46,000 and change square miles, and Virginia is 42,775 square miles, which makes Maryland practically 1/4 of the size of Pennsylvania and less than 1/3 of the size of Virginia. So if we break those numbers down even further to make them more relevant to our discussion today, we look at the percentages. If we calculate the percentages of the state contained, or the watershed that is located within each state, Virginia has the largest chunk of watershed. So 54% of Virginia is contained, is covered by the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And that's followed by Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has the smallest percentage of the state, which is 50%. Then that's followed closely by Virginia, which is at 54%. And then if you look at Maryland in comparison, it's 94% of Maryland is found within the Bay watershed. A note about Pennsylvania, because as you can see from this map, it's the only one of these 3 states that we're focusing on today that does not contain any parts of the actual Chesapeake Bay, which is that strip of blue you see here coming down through Maryland and Virginia and then out into the Atlantic. Just because Pennsylvania does not contain any of the main section of the Chesapeake Bay does not mean that what happens there is any less meaningful. I'd like you all to take a look at this map showing an overview of Pennsylvania's stream locations. Pennsylvania has 85,000 miles of streams. Water is everywhere. In fact, Pennsylvania has the highest stream density of any state in the continental United States, and it's second nationally only to Alaska. Just for a frame of reference here, Maryland has approximately 8,800 miles of freshwater streams. So Maryland has approximately 1/10 of the mileage of streams that Pennsylvania has. What happens in Pennsylvania matters. So the next important thing to look at is population. Maryland has a little over 6 million people. Pennsylvania has more than twice as many people, coming in close to 13 million. And Virginia falls in the middle with about 8.5 million people. But what makes these numbers really important for our discussion here today is understanding where these people are located, right? So let's start with Maryland. Here's a map of Maryland population centers. The darker the red, the higher the population density. If we think about how much of the state of Maryland lies within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, about 99% of Marylanders reside within that area, which means that when you're talking about Chesapeake Bay related issues and legislation, you're talking about issues that affect 99% of the population of Maryland. Let's also take a look at Virginia's population centers. Again, the darker the red, the higher the population density. 80% of people who live in Virginia live within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So similarly to Maryland, a very high percentage of people in Virginia are affected by bay watershed related issues and regulations. Now let's contrast that with Pennsylvania. Again, here's a map of Pennsylvania population centers. Again, in red, darker the red, the higher the population. If you look at this map, a lot of the red is located to the left and to the right of where the Bay watershed falls down the middle of the state. Compared to Maryland's 99% and Virginia's 80%, only 30% of Pennsylvanians live within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The other 2/3 are in the Delaware watershed over here. You can see my mouse over here, these high population areas. And then the Ohio watershed over here on the left of your map, the Erie watershed up here, and then the Genesee, there's a very small part of the Genesee watershed up close to New York, which means that Chesapeake Bay watershed issues are issues that directly affect only 1/3 of Pennsylvanians, as opposed to 99% of Marylanders and 80% of Virginians. So with that, I'd like to invite the elected officials present to come back on video and turn on your sound. And I'd like to hand it over to Senator Martin to facilitate a discussion about what that means for you and the work that you do.
Hi, can you hear me? Good. Well, thanks for having me on today. It's a pleasure to be here. And this is a wonderful discussion we've had in the past, and one I think that we absolutely need to keep sharing with folks. I think what I find to be most fascinating with some of the slides that you had just shown is, and for people to correlate it in their minds, is a lot of places where you saw those population densities is also where you would then see the more dense population of elected officials. So not only is it less population that's in there, but when you talk about the number of legislators in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you can imagine then they're typically where the more populous areas are. I have colleagues in the middle part of the state that might have 5 giant counties, all to encompass 250,000 people just in one senatorial district, when Philadelphia might have 10 or more senators just in their locale where they're at. So when you talk about the priorities of what's on the agenda in Pennsylvania, a lot of times those priorities are derived from the folks where most people come from. They tend to find common ground in areas. So when we over the years are looking at things related to the Bay, the focus isn't really productive in terms of just building coalitions with people within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but having to build coalitions with folks beyond the state on a similar topic, such as clean water in general. As you've shown with the density of our streams that we have here, the fact that we're against the Erie waterfront. We have the 3 rivers in the southeast. We have the Delaware River on our eastern side. Is how do you potentially build partnerships and coalitions with folks to get a program done that does benefit the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and at the same time ensure that so many of the resources that are needed, that even if you create a program, are actually coming in to help the watershed and not going out towards the most populous areas. So it's a really interesting dynamic that we have in Pennsylvania. And quite frankly, what's wonderful is I think most of my colleagues that I get to work with that fall within the Chesapeake watershed love the Chesapeake Bay. They care about clean water. They care about making a difference to the Bay, but oftentimes it's getting the attention of others to join these efforts, which can sometimes be difficult in terms of getting things across the goal line.
So I guess from a Virginia perspective, we're kind of a hybrid, right, between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And so, we do have a majority of the state is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, nothing like what Maryland has, but I think unlike Pennsylvania, our population centers are focused and concentrated in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so You do have elected officials who represent areas that have a vested interest in the economy of the Chesapeake Bay. I think, one of the things that Senator Martin had talked about in previous conversations was the impact that has in terms of funding, right? And so for Pennsylvania, if you want funding for the Chesapeake Bay restoration, the rest of the state's going to want a piece of that, right? Because ultimately this comes down to, restoring your local watershed resources. And so I think, for Pennsylvania, the challenge is that anytime you want to get money for the Chesapeake, you're going to have to, I think, triple that, right? In order to make sure that all of the state gets to share. And so I thought that was a really interesting dynamic. And we have that here in Virginia as well. And so even for our Water Quality Improvement Fund, we've been very careful to make sure that we're kind of spreading the wealth, not only in the Chesapeake Bay, but also the areas outside the Chesapeake Bay, although that's changed a little bit as we're approaching, that 2025 Chesapeake Bay restoration target, with the recognition that, a lot of our upgrades to wastewater treatment and stormwater need to be focused in these areas where we've got a regulatory deadline. But I suspect on the back end of that, once we've met those goals, there's going to be an expectation that we're going to ramp up funding in other parts of the state. So, again, they too can enjoy that local water quality.
And Senator Martin, just a perspective from the Maryland side of things, I'm so fortunate. I represent a district that is surrounded by the Chesapeake Bay. I have Annapolis in southern Anne Arundel County, one of 47 senators in Maryland. The Bay and the environment polls #1 in my district. So it's very clear what my constituents expect of me. But the challenge for all of us as legislators, when we have to work with folks from across a state or a commonwealth, is how do we bring people along with us? And so I like to think about that in the context of particularly Pennsylvania, when you don't have the benefit of having the Bay right in the backyard. That slide on stream density that Molly put up, I think, is critical for appreciating the scope of the challenge before us. But I think it also points to an opportunity for us to work together. So just as I have to convince my colleagues in other parts of Maryland, Montgomery County or Howard County, that what they do upstream is impacting what happens downstream in my district, we have to carry that message forward in our conversations regionally as well. So I think focusing on the commonalities that we can piece together because of these differences is just so important in us finding common ground and finding things that we can work on upstream and downstream that are really going to have an impact on protecting and preserving the Chesapeake Bay.
All right, terrific. Should I move on to the next section? All right. Political subdivisions. So I want to touch briefly on political subdivisions. There are many layers to this topic, and we're not going to get into all of them today just because of time. But here are a few key things that I think are worth noting. Let's start with counties. Maryland has 24 counties, including Baltimore City. Pennsylvania has 67 counties, and Virginia has 95 counties, as well as 38 independent cities. So just looking at those numbers alone, Virginia has 4 times as many counties as Maryland, and Pennsylvania has 2.5 times as many counties as Maryland. If we move on to municipalities, I got fancy with the slide because I think that this is worth kind of presenting to you chunk by chunk. Maryland has 157 counties, towns, and villages. Virginia has 229 cities and towns. And then Pennsylvania has 2,560 different cities, boroughs, and townships. Some more information about Pennsylvania. Out of that 2,560 number, 1,454 of those are townships. And those townships cover 95% of Pennsylvania's land area. And about 44% of the population of Pennsylvania resides in a township. So in the smallest type of municipality in Pennsylvania. Those townships range in population from fewer than 200 people to more than 60,000 people. So not all townships look alike, and I would assume, but I'm hoping Senator Martin will address it when we get to the discussion, that it really affects the way that he interacts with local municipalities. The last thing I'd like to bring up on the slide, and then I'm going to hand it back over to our panelists, is the concept of a Dillon rule state versus a home rule state. Virginia is a Dillon rule state, which means that all of these smaller political subdivisions that we just spoke about may only exercise local power if that local power is sanctioned by the state level of government. So specifically sanctioned by that state umbrella level of government. When you compare this to a home rule state, local political jurisdictions are granted certain umbrella powers of home rule authority. So instead of needing every specific power granted at that state level, they are able to actually make some decisions at that local level instead of having to go back to the state for permission for every specific thing. Both Maryland and Pennsylvania have granted certain local political subdivisions this home rule authority. So this Dillon versus home rule concept came up repeatedly in the questions that you as an audience submitted during registration prior to this presentation. So I would also love to hear from our elected officials about this issue specifically as we move into the discussion.
Chairman, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, actually, I got a question for you, Senator Martin, which is how on earth do you do it with that many municipalities? How do you actually coordinate and make things happen? And I guess it's a double-edged sword, right? Which is you have you can take greater ownership if you have smaller local units, but you also don't have the economies of scale, and it's tougher to be able to get that kind of cooperation on a large scale. So how is Pennsylvania doing in that regard, and what mechanisms do you have, and what are those challenges, and how do you trying to address those?
It can be very difficult, though, we do have a lot of municipalities, I'll say right up front, that work together, that work collaboratively. Land use is, and a lot of decisions pertaining to it actually happen at that local municipal level. I can tell you, as my days as a county commissioner, though we had a county planning commission and other countywide bodies, really the only leverage that you had or carrot to put out there was resources, to create certain shares that they would have to match in order to get them to move towards a common goal somehow. It could also be really difficult sometimes, and I know we had this in one of our presentations with the Bay before, is terms of the state keeping track of maybe all the different things that relate to making a difference with clean water or making a difference in terms of bay health, because there's so many resources that are also put in from the local level in projects that they specifically focus on, as opposed to maybe one that DEP in the state of Pennsylvania might be involved in. And, we've really been pushing to try to create a more itemization of a more overall effort that's been going on related to this, and trying to push DEP or encourage them to do that. But often it's the resources that actually try to get that collaboration, and some are very, very cooperative. And some, Pennsylvania, anytime you talk about municipal consolidation or school district consolidation, because we're in the same boat with that, to like a countywide model, people get very upset. I mean, they're very territorial. They love the township they've been in, the history and generations of families that have been living in that township. So that change is never easy. Though there should be hopefully some efforts in the future to maybe readdress that. But no doubt about it, Chairman, the resources are what really tend to bring people together.
Yeah, and that local pride, most certainly. We have school districts, that are, really ought to be consolidated in Virginia, and it doesn't come down to efficiencies or resources. It comes down to, which mascot it's going to be, and, which side, your family is always rooted for. So those personal dynamics, really kind of come on there. With regard to Dillon rule, maybe I can start the conversation on that, because Virginia is very much a Dillon rule state. And as Molly said, it's just a premise that localities don't have any authority unless the state has provided that authority in the Code of Virginia, as opposed to assuming that they have that authority unless it's taken away. I guess what's interesting is that there's nothing in our Constitution that says we're a Dillon Rule state. It's a judicial construct, and so it's not like we could just repeal being a Dillon Rule state. But it does come down to, what kind of authority that you want to be able to provide to localities, and the way that you pass laws and regulations can basically make the difference between whether you are really a Dillon Rule state or not. And so, when I think about things like the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act in Virginia, it's actually very broad, right? And so sometimes it's not well taken advantage of, but there's language in there that says, localities can preserve vegetation to the maximum extent practicable, or that developers have to reduce land disturbance, as much as possible during the development process. And so again, it really, for us as legislators, we have to really think very hard about, what kind of authority we're granting localities, and is there a reason to have consistency at the state level, or, should we write our legislation very broadly to say, hey, you localities know what's best under your circumstances. We're going to allow you to go through a process and able to come up with something, that works for you. So, Senator Elfreth, I think that Maryland is mostly home rule, but maybe is a little bit of a hybrid. So we'd be interested in kind of hearing your perspective.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we are a hybrid when it comes particularly to our counties. We have 3 different structures of how our counties can operate. Mostly they kind of follow the line of population size. And then from there, whether it's a group of county commissioners or county executive. And so depending on the size of the county, which county every day, if you gave me a quiz right now, it would be a little hard for me to pass that one, and who has what powers without us granting them or not. But what I appreciate about this part of the discussion, I think the stream density is important, but also this question of number of municipalities. And I, of the 157 that Maryland has, I represent 2 of them. I have the city of Annapolis, the capital city, just under 40,000 people. And then I have a very small, wonderful little municipality called Highland Beach that is around 100 people, give or take. But the challenges with an extra layer of municipality for me in Maryland, and I think this is part of the reason that complicates policy, is you're going to have, in Pennsylvania's case, that many more city councils, that many more mayors, that many more personalities and decision-making points when it comes to the things that really impact the Chesapeake Bay, when it comes to development and taking down trees or disturbing watersheds, when it comes to any kind of land use policy, stormwater regulations, anything like that. So the extra layer of bureaucracy in bringing in all of those municipalities around a centralized policy, I think it's just an added pressure point. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way, Dillon Rule, home rule, more municipalities versus fewer, but I think it just helps color this conversation about what is the challenge we have as a commission and as policymakers in front of us, and how do we work through those challenges.
So Senator Martin, how does that manifest itself in Pennsylvania?
Well, I'm going to point back to something Senator Elfreth said a little bit ago. Sometimes it's, what are the common issues that can bring people together, or how can you frame an issue? I think for the longest time, I think where I started to see the tide turn, where people really started to care about issues surrounding water, wasn't necessarily when we were talking about the Chesapeake Bay. Though we have a lot of folks that enjoy it, go down there. I mean, I think I'm like 40 minutes from it, from where I'm at. When you started talking about clean water and our own waterways, which, as you've heard, we have a lot of here, that's where over time the conversation started to shift. And I think we started to get more interest in, really targeting our own waterways. And then hence that obviously then has a downstream impact in terms of everything that we're doing. So we're taking what we've done on the local level here, and really saying, okay, how do we find that commonality? And Senator Yaw, who's my colleague from Pennsylvania on the commission, and I are really trying to build the right partnerships with other watershed areas, flying that same banner of clean water. Because as you see, they all have plenty of miles of streams. They obviously have waterfront in different areas, but how do we get people to rally around it? And it's, I think we've made progress. We're not where we need to be, But I do think since it's turned to a clean water discussion as opposed to just a bay discussion, even in central PA, that I think that's what's leading us to, be able to take more steps.
Great. All right, Molly.
We
Thank-
have a couple of more minutes for this section, and I have a question that just came in from the audience that I'd like to pose. How consistent is the technical information, guidance, and priorities among the various major river basins? Do these differences create barriers to aligning constituents?
So are you talking about guidance from state regulatory agencies to localities, or?
Let's start there.
Okay, yeah, I know for Virginia, our Department of Environmental Quality strives as hard as they can to do that. And so, they're looking at two things, which is how do you provide that consistent guidance so that things that are reported to them, that they know that they are, using the same kind of formulas and methodology, so then they can turn around and feed that information to the Chesapeake Bay program and go into the Chesapeake Bay model. While also realizing, per that last conversation we just had, is you don't want to squash creativity at the local level when you have innovative ideas or concepts for how do you do watershed restoration. So again, I think at least in Virginia, our Department of Environmental Quality and DCR try very hard to put those things together. Realizing they could be difficult to do and get everybody on the same page, and they are always works in progress. And I know in my professional life, I pepper poor DEQ all the time with, what did you mean by this, and can we do that? Sometimes they say yes or no, and other times they say, well, that's a great question. Let us mull on that. But yeah, it's important to strike that right balance, and I think we're getting there, at least in Virginia.
This is an issue, I think, when we talk about, as a commission, when we talk about agriculture, we use the words technical assistance a lot, that our farmers really need to be using best management practices. But the same thing I think is true for our municipalities and our counties, the need for greater technical assistance. When we have a municipality of 10,000 or fewer people, how are we ensuring that they are making the most balanced and science-based land use decisions or stormwater decisions? So I think that one of the answers here is greater technical assistance from the state level to support these smaller municipalities to make the better decisions for the Bay. And I hesitate to say that because that is a growing of government, but I think it's important because all of these small municipalities throughout the watershed are making very important decisions on behalf of the rest of us. And I think more technical assistance, more support, more science-based information would go a long way.
Two things I would say from a Pennsylvania standpoint is I completely agree. The technical assistance and resources, no different than you do for planning. Our countywide planners try their best to get out to the local communities to assist and provide tools to help them make those local decisions where we can. But the other thing I would say is I think it's getting better. I think Patrick McDonald, who our Secretary of DEP here, he can remember back in the beginning of implementing things like MS4 and stormwater management related things. There tended to be a lot of moving goalposts, or municipalities would invest the resources in accordance with the guidance they were given, but then turn around and have it rejected, even though it was based on that guidance. And that was quite a fury in the early years of getting them situated. And of course, sometimes those frustrations turn people off even to cooperate at all. And these municipalities are trying. They spend money on engineers and other folks to try to do it right. And can be nothing more frustrating than if you think you did it right and all of a sudden they change the goalposts on you. And so that's something I think we always need to strive for, is that we're giving them the best guidance possible, but that we're being consistent with it. And the chairman made a really good point too, is, our municipalities vary in size of technical expertise, resources, even taxing ability. If you're a little grown out borough or something like that, and you really can't afford to overly tax your folks more, sometimes you got to allow creativity. If someone has a good idea that's going to make a difference, don't be so rigid that you're going to shoot down every idea, because a little bit of progress is better than no progress at all. And quite frankly, I think over the years, we've had too many cases of no progress at all with some of these things. So being flexible in terms of what they're able to do creatively, and maybe they have resources specifically, maybe they applied for a grant from a certain foundation that would like to see something done. To me, that needs to be part of everything moving forward.
And just to quickly build on something that Senator Elfreth went ahead and mentioned on the technical assistance side, because I know that's critical in terms of agricultural BMPs, and in Virginia, our soil and water conservation districts delivering that, and it's peer on peer. It is also really important, I think, with respect to urban and suburban development. And, we have very fast growing local governments that just simply get overwhelmed with the amount of rezonings, the amount of development that comes through, and they don't have time to stop and think about the long-term implications of how they are designing and developing these, and the tools that are out there, transfer of development rights or cluster development, and how all of these kind of fit into long-term sustainability. And so that is an area that I wish we had more of in Virginia, was that kind of direct technical assistance to help some of our fast-growing localities, and quite honestly, even some of our bigger localities that are redeveloping, so we can, roll back or fix some of the mistakes that we've made in the past.
Molly, if we have just a moment, I want to amplify what Senator Martin said about creativity as well, because we can't forget that our regulations and our overall goals are so important, but so is creativity here. And this is a science, and we can't forget that. And here in my district, really being we have projects that are on the cutting edge of using nature to reclaim some stormwater runoff portions, particularly in the city of Annapolis, which is an urban setting, and really pushing the envelope on creativity of how to rethink that, not just piping water from one place directly into the bay. And so, sometimes I wish that we had a little more flexibility to be creative and solve some of these problems. So I thought it was a great point, Senator Martin, and maybe a place that we could work more regionally on these solutions.
And if I can add one more thing, and I maybe probably bridges both of the discussion, but we talk about the pressures of local municipal officials in terms of Pennsylvania's geography and where things are happening. The central part of the state, which is happens to be the Bay watershed, also is one of the fastest growing areas of our state, and that's going to have repercussions across the board in terms of the pressures on these local governments making land use decisions, but also. And to tie it back to the first conversation, is there's a shifting dynamic of elected positions as well. Maybe a decade ago, they had to take a state representative seat from out west and they put it in Lancaster County. Well, already again, we've grown so much, they're taking another seat from out west. We're up for redistricting and reapportionment. You're seeing more of the growth to the central part of the state and the Chester County and the southeast part. So that's going to have implications in terms of not only local land use decisions, but it's also going to have implications in terms of the agenda, hopefully, or the priorities that are put in place, because you're going to have more people rallying around these issues. So hopefully that's a positive.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all so much for giving such a thorough and great answer to that question. I'm going to move us along, shift gears a little bit to general assemblies. We'll start with districts. In Maryland, there are 47 different districts, both for the House and the Senate. They are coterminous. So both the House and the Senate districts share the same geographic boundaries. In Pennsylvania, there are 50 Senate districts and 203 House districts. And in Virginia, there are 40 Senate districts and 100 House districts. Look a little bit more closely at Maryland. For each of Maryland's 47 districts, there is 1 senator and 3 delegates, for a total of 47 senators and 141 delegates. Breaking that down, that means that each senator represents approximately 123,000 people, and each delegate represents anywhere from 41,000 to 123,000 people, depending on if and how his or her district is broken up into sub-districts. In Pennsylvania, there are 50 Senate districts and 203 House districts, each with 1 member of the General Assembly representing it, for a total of 50 senators and 203 representatives. Each Pennsylvania representative represents approximately 254,000 people, and each Pennsylvania senator represents approximately 254,000 people, and each representative approximately 63,500 people. These districts are not coterminous, so they overlap boundaries. A member of the House of Representatives may represent people who reside in more than one Senate district and vice versa. The same is true in Virginia, where there are 40 Senate districts and 100 House districts, and 40 senators and 100 delegates, representing, again, those non-coterminous districts. Each senator represents approximately 200,000 people, and each delegate represents approximately 80,000 people. So if we look at these numbers side by side, some interesting similarities and differences start to emerge, right? Let's focus on the Senate for a second. Pretty similar in numbers if you look at these. If you look at party control, we have Maryland and Virginia with a Democratic majority and Pennsylvania with a Republican-held majority. All of these senators are on 4-year election terms. One thing to note here is that Pennsylvania holds Senate elections every 2 years, with 50% of Senate members going in front of the voters each time. And if you compare that to all senators in Maryland and Virginia, they are all in the same 4-year election cycle. So all 47 and all 40 respectively go up in front of the voters at the same time. Now on the House side, here we see some pretty drastic differences in numbers. Pennsylvania has twice the number of representatives that Virginia has delegates, with Maryland falling in the middle, right? Political party control is the same for each as it is in the Senate, but now let's notice the difference in these term lengths. Both Pennsylvania and Virginia House members serve 2-year terms before they go back in front of the voters, and in Maryland, they serve 4-year terms. I'd like to hand it back over to our panel. I think that there's some really, for a lay person, there was some really interesting meaty issues that I think would influence the way you all, the work that you do. But I am making assumptions on my end, and I would love to hear it from you. Does the difference in election cycles matter? What about the numbers of people that you work with? The size of the General Assemblies, does that change how you work with each other?
I guess I could start, and maybe it's kind of a question for Senator Elfreth, because Maryland has the coterminous districts, which is a completely foreign concept to me. I mean, the Senate draws its districts in Virginia, and the House draws its districts. We're actually going through a redistricting reform, so they're likely to continue to be kind of off kilter like that. And so while we work with our senators and back and forth, you don't tend to work as a team in the sense that I would imagine that Maryland would. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool, right? Because you got your band of folks there, and they're all working for your same area. And then one very astute Marylander said, well, that works great unless you don't like your teammates. And so then I thought, well, that could be really awkward if you don't get along. And so I am curious, for Senator Elfreth, how does that work from a practical standpoint in Maryland? Because I'm used to Virginia, where we do our stuff in the House and they do their stuff in the Senate, and we're elected on different cycles.
I'll just start by saying, if I had to run every 2 years, I'm not sure I would do this job, because it's incredibly difficult to run for office and raise that money and have, a lot of your time and energy focused on campaigning and less on legislating. So I'm very grateful, number one, for a 4-year term. And number two, I really do enjoy having 3 delegates within my district. Now, I'm a little bit of a hybrid. I have a sub-district of two members in the more urban and suburban part of my district, and then 1 member in the southern rural part of my district. And so while I work with all 3 of them, not the 2 and the 1 don't necessarily have to work together because they don't co-represent any spaces. So that's a bit of a challenge sometimes, but otherwise I think it's helpful from a representation standpoint of, it's better to have 4 people working towards a goal than just 1. But it's also from a legislative standpoint and the dynamics between any upper and lower chamber, regardless of state or body, to have folks who are looking out for your legislation or pieces of legislation that are important to your district, to have partners in my case, the House, helping to see that legislation through. None of us can pass any laws on our own. It takes a village, it takes a team. And I really do look at my delegates in my district and the folks I get to work with every day as, if I need something in the House, they're typically my first call, and typically care about the same issues that I do, because we are fortunate to represent the same people. So I frankly think our situation makes a whole lot of sense, and I can't imagine it any other way.
Yeah, I would agree. It's having a local delegation. I'm fortunate, a county of about, I'm only in one county. I have the bottom half of Lancaster County. There's only 2 senators here, each of us having that 250 some odd thousand people. But also our House members, we have another, I think 7 Republicans and 1 Democrat from Lancaster County to be able to work with and partner with on various things. And quite frankly, you see a lot of that in Pennsylvania in the way the General Assembly operates. We call them like the Southeast guys and girls, whether they're Republican or Democrat. If there's an issue that they're rallying around, transportation, whatever it might be, that they tend to stick together. And that's a powerful voting block in getting things done. We're seeing more of that in Central PA. I know Lancaster and York really work collaboratively to try to push various things, and also even putting people into leadership, because those are some critical positions too. Right now, the Speaker of the House is from Lancaster County, Brian Cutler, Butts, Maryland. He's actually my state representative where I live. And it took a lot of folks sticking together and making that a goal to get done. But you do see that geographic, regardless of parties, lining up sometimes on various issues to, bring things or change that impacts their area. Now we're about to go through a redistricting and process where the seats are redrawn for the state Senate and the state House. Our senators are 4 years. Half the body is up during the presidential cycle, and half the body's up during the gubernatorial cycle that we have here, which would be in 2024. I'm sorry, 2022. And right now, after the census, the lines will get redrawn. The 4 leaders, the majority and minority leader in the House, the majority and minority leader in the Senate, and a 5th person, which they're supposed to agree upon, which they never have in the history of the system. The Supreme Court then puts the 5th person on. And so they just did that recently. So a lot of folks are anxious to see what comes of redistricting, because that also involves adjusting for the changes in Pennsylvania's population in terms of meeting the number requirements for a House member or a senator. So
yeah, so I guess from a Virginia perspective, something that was highlighted on there as a difference is that we have our elections in off years as opposed to Maryland and Pennsylvania being aligned with the federal cycle. And so it used to mean, and it was put in there, quite frankly, as a way to insulate from federal issues and to kind of keep it close to home as a state. And so for a long time, Virginia's elections would be relatively sleepy. That is, of course, changed dramatically, now that Virginia is purplish blue. And so as a result, we are the first elections right after presidential elections, and we kind of serve as a bellwether for how things are going and as a harbinger for those midterm elections. And so what was designed to keep things focused on local and state issues have all of a sudden put a real spotlight on Virginia. And I think New Jersey is the other state that falls under that. So it's interesting, as we go into our 2021 election, we're dealing with both state issues, but we're also dealing with a raft of federal issues as well, that I know, for Maryland and Pennsylvania, that's probably old hat, that you guys deal with that, but it's kind of new for us here in Virginia. I do have a question for Senator Martin. So 203 members of the House of Representatives, that's huge. And I'm curious how that affects the decision-making process, because I imagine your decision-making process within your leadership has to be much more structured in order to be able to deal with that many people. But I'm curious whether you see that and how that manifests itself with respect to environmental issues.
Well, the history of that is actually it was a mistake apparently when it became 203. That's what the historians tell us, that it was actually supposed to be about 150, I believe. There's been bills to actually shrink the size of the legislature, and namely the House, because of how large it really is. But it definitely is something to consider, and there are definitely a lot more. I mean, in the Senate, we all have a lot of diversity to our districts. We have, here I have Lancaster City, I have a broad suburban area, but also have a lot of rural as well. And most senators have that. And I think that really goes into how they approach their job and how they look at various issues. A lot of these House members, they're elected from either extremely blue districts or extremely red districts. And though they're representing their district, that can tend to have influence on, where, they might not budge on something or go along with something. So it definitely comes into play. And I'll just say this, Chairman, as a last thought, your system sounds so enticing to me as someone who always is up in a presidential cycle. And it seems like it's all about federal and presidential politics every time, and to the detriment of state issues in my mind. I actually get asked more about federal issues when I run for re-election than I do about the job I actually do. So I do envy a little bit of what you guys have.
So I have two quick thoughts on, we too are up for redistricting, obviously, after the census. And there's a conversation here in Maryland about moving our House to single member districts instead of the 3 members per district. And, I have some feelings about that, because I'm afraid, Senator Martin, that we might move to more in that direction that you might have in Pennsylvania, where the smaller your district, the kind of more focused maybe your perspective is, and the less willing you are to compromise and work with others who are not representing similar spaces. And obviously we have not as a nation or any of our states found the right kind of balance between the size of district and what that means for representation, but it's certainly a challenge. And then for Chairman Bulova, here in Maryland, it's kind of an unwritten rule that, the first year of a 4-year term, you might get some stuff done, but maybe not. Everybody's kind of finding their way. Second and third years, when we get the heart of the work done for the term, the hard controversial stuff. And then in an election year, it's tends to be more difficult to get those controversial bills through. So we have that kind of 4-year cycle in a term, but how does it work with a 2-year term? When do you deal with the controversial issues?
Pretty much every year, right? And it because you don't get that break, and so when you're up for every 2 years, you are expected to go down there and perform. Put in legislation, push really hard. So you're either coming off the campaign trail or you're heading into a campaign season, where you're going to be judged on what it is that you've been able to get across the finish line, and juxtapose that against our Senate, which are 4-year terms, and so they have a whole different dynamic, kind of along what you're saying, which is, let's slow down the train. We can look at this, and so they, even if we have to make really controversial decisions, oftentimes they will have those 2, 3, 4 years in order to be able to recover and shift gears, and not have that be the next thing that they have to deal with in an election. So it does create an interesting dynamic between the House and the Senate, where we, hopefully there's no other senators listening, we tend to throw a bunch of stuff in, right? And the senators kind of sit back and say, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at these things. But I think the two together makes for a healthy dynamic.
I don't know, Molly, if this is something you're going to get into next, but I thought I remember in one of our presentations, one of the other ways we differ is, was it Maryland, that are there caps in terms of how many bills each member can have and focus on? I remember it was one of the other states in the watershed. I know we don't have that in Pennsylvania, so it's like a free for, like I think I have like 38 different ones that, because in your district someone says, I need you to work on this, you do a bill, but I found that to be interesting from the standpoint of sometimes I think, would that make things more efficient and targeted in getting things done? Because when it's a free-for-all, it takes, I think, much longer for it to come up next in line as an important issue.
So, Senator Alfred, before you answer that question, that's actually a great segue into the next section of the presentation, which is the legislative process overview. So, Senator Alfred, if you would go ahead and answer that, and then I'm going to move us into that so that we can get through the next couple of slides, because I think that they will help address some of those differences as well.
Yes, Senator Martin. So Maryland, our Senate at least, just implemented a rule in January for the start of this session that we would be capped at 25 bills per senator but that didn't count delegation bills or by request bills. So I chair the pensions committee and the county delegation, so that wouldn't count towards my 25. I don't think anybody enforced it per se. I think it is a step in the right direction. Molly's going to talk in a second about our 90-day session. So when we have a lot of senators introducing more than 25 bills, we do get bogged down in the work that is just becoming, I think, less and less possible to produce good work in that 90-day timeframe if we're, have a free for all of the number of bills. But Molly, it's perfect segue.
Yeah, and if I could just to kind of build on that, and before we segue over to Molly, which is, so it used to be that it was a free for all in Virginia, that you could introduce as much as you want. We had some, some people who would introduce, 40 or 50 bills. Most people would introduce somewhere in the 15 to 20 range. It was really the limit was how much time and effort can you actually spend on marshaling your bills through the system. A couple of years ago, we changed it so that during our long sessions, 60-day sessions, you could introduce as many as you wanted. During our short sessions, the 45-day sessions in the House, we self-imposed a 15 bill limit. This last session, because we were fully virtual, we went ahead and narrowed that down even more. So each of us was limited to 7 bills in the House and then 12 bills in the Senate. And I think what was interesting is it did force us to prioritize what we were putting in and to reduce redundant legislation. I think people from Virginia can absolutely attest that it didn't keep us from addressing some really major policy questions, but it meant instead of having 10 bills dealing with the same subject, you had 1 bill and we coordinated ahead of time. But it does, and ours is enforced. Our legislative services, you get to your bill maximum and you can't file or introduce anything more. So it's a hard cap.
That really is a perfect segue into our next section. And I would invite our panelists to stay on camera if you would like, as we move forward through this one, because I think that there'll be good discussion in each slide, although we might need to speed through it a little bit in order to cover all of the ground that we want to do today. So how a bill becomes a law. When Ann Swanson and I first sat down to discuss how to put this together, this is where I assumed that I was going to be spending the entire presentation. And it turns out that, all of the building blocks to how a bill becomes a law are actually pretty similar in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The extremely simplified version looks like this. Bill is introduced. The bill is considered by a relevant committee and subcommittees. The bill may or may not come out of committee, but if it does, it goes to the full chamber in which it was introduced for debate and vote. If it passes through that chamber, it goes to the other chamber for pretty much the same exact process. And if it makes it through the other chamber with no changes, then it goes to the governor for signing. Let's talk about some of the really interesting differences in that process, though. And we'll start with the length of session, which I know our panelists have already mentioned. In Maryland, you have a 90-day session every year. In Virginia, the session is 60 days in even-numbered years and 45 days in odd-number years. Both in Maryland and Virginia, those sessions begin in January. Pennsylvania's session, on the other hand, lasts for 2 years, running from the first Tuesday of January and adjourning in the November of a even-numbered year. A note about this, because it was confusing to a layperson when I first started looking into it. Even though Pennsylvania's session is 2 years in length, that doesn't mean that the General Assembly is actually in session every day for 2 years. And when I was speaking to people who do this for a living, what they were describing, the numbers of days in session that they were describing averaged out over that 2-year session, lined up pretty much with how many days Virginia is in session over 2 years. So how does this affect, I think that the panelists have already covered a little bit about how this affects the work that they do, and when and how they have to approach the legislation that they are moving forward to benefit the Bay. But do you all have anything to add to this slide before I move on?
I'll just add one really quick thing, which is Virginia is super efficient when it comes to the length of our sessions. A lot of bills, as we went ahead and mentioned, I think each session, regardless of whether it's short or long, we have between 2,000 and 3,000 bills. I think what it does force us to do, again, is you got one shot at getting bills through. We do rely very heavily on our subcommittee systems, and I think you're going to talk a little bit more about that under the committee structure, but it does give a lot of powers to our subcommittees in order to be able to handle that volume. I also think that it matters a lot with respect to the timing of legislation and making sure constituents understand the timing of legislation, both in terms of if they want something introduced or if they want to testify for something. And so one of our big problems is, you'll have a big bill that's going through, and you're making decisions in real time, and you won't find out until after the session is wrapped up, that constituents had concerns about that, and it's kind of natural. You got a 30-day window or a 60-day window, chop that in half, for before crossover, and so trying to communicate people, that you need to, that you can have a bill that comes up and within a week, it's made it through one body and it's over to the other side, and that can be dangerous for democracy sometimes. And so you really need to communicate that to your constituents, that they need to be able to track those things.
That's an excellent point, Chairman Bulova. I really enjoy Maryland's 90-day session. I like the urgency that it creates for us. And if you're not, if you start to think about a bill in January, it's frankly too late to see it through to fruition. I get the sense that maybe Virginia is the same way. But it is a sprint for 90 days. And we all joke that pre-COVID, we're all working so hard and together so long that we all get a bit of kennel cough because we're together and working late nights. But I think it does produce a good product. I think if we were to further limit some of the bill introductions, I think we would frankly have a better work product at the end of the day, because the number of bills introduced has only ever gone up. It's never gone down, but 90 days has stayed the same for 150 years. So how do we have an opportunity to really work group important legislation? Now, I serve on a committee that believes heavily and utilizes work groups for the larger policy questions that we have in front of us, but not every committee has that capacity to do it. In the House, House of Delegates in Maryland, they rely heavily on subcommittees as well. In the Senate, not so much outside of the Budget Committee, particular to a section of the budget. So different dynamics between the two bodies as well. I think the House relies on subcommittees a lot to utilize the greater number of delegates than we have in the Senate. But I enjoy the 90-day session. And Senator Merton, I'm so curious how your 2-year, is there a sense of urgency to get things done or to address things quickly, or how does the 2-year affect the actual process?
Well, I agree with you. Sine die, and also the budget. When we're coming down the stretch for the budget, it tends to be where we see the most flurry of activity. I mean, traditionally, I know in the Senate, we're a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday on the weeks we're in session, and the other days are in district days, or they're out. We can have committee meetings outside of those days. We go around the state, have hearings on various topics, but it is a long and drawn out process. But I think I have another comment about Pennsylvania's 2 years, but I think it ties into the next area, talking about committee structure and what that 2 years means to that.
Fantastic. So the next slide is going to talk about when the bill is introduced, and it's got some pretty significant numbers on it. And these numbers, I want the audience to understand that these numbers are not apples to apples to apples. They're more apples to oranges to apples, because we are talking about bills passed versus bills enacted. So we don't know how much of this percentage is due to a governor's veto. But I do want to show that 3,000 to 4,000 bills at least in 2018 were introduced into each one of our state's general assemblies, and 28% of those bills in Maryland were passed. 6% of those bills in Pennsylvania were enacted, and 33% of those bills in Virginia were passed. And I'm going to ask our panelists to hold off on talking about this until the next slide, which talks about the committee process, because once a bill is introduced, it then gets sent to the relevant committee in either the House or the Senate. So you can see the number of standing committees on this screen. But one thing that I really have heard from our commission members about the reasons for those differences in passage and or enacted rates has to do with the committee process and the subcommittee process and how many of those bills actually make it out of committee. So Senator Martin, would you start with Pennsylvania? Because I was very interested to hear the last time we spoke about this, what happens in committee to bills in Pennsylvania.
No, thank you. You know, when you have 2 years that you're in session, you basically have the same roster of individuals typically, unless there's a special election of some sort, but typically you have the same composition of members, but you also have the same chairman. And chairmen are extremely powerful in terms of what gets moved and not moved. And that can be very frustrating. You could have bills that have, you know, huge bipartisan numbers of individuals that are on them, and yet certain bills don't move. Typically, the leaders don't delve down into the chairman's business per se. They occasionally might lean on them if there's something that they absolutely need to, but the leaders don't really control anything until it comes to the floor. It gets put on the calendar after it's gone through the committee process. But I could tell you even firsthand, you know, whether bills related to Senator Yaw has gotten done in the Chesapeake Bay that has passed the Senate either unanimously or one negative vote, and then if that particular chairman isn't fond of that bill, you know, whether it's fertilizer or something else like that we've been working on, and it doesn't move at all, and it might not move for up to 2 years, depending on when you actually passed it. It can be very frustrating. But you know, when you have, you know, there's something that needs to be improved if you have bills that can pass a body unanimously, and then it sees absolutely no movement, and it's on a wide range of topics. But that shows you that there's got to be process improvements.
Terrific. Do either of our other panelists have anything to mention about the committee process before I move on?
Sure. Just briefly in Maryland, I think it's unique to us, but we only serve on one standing committee. So our focus during our legislative session, my focus is on the budget and taxation policies, and so I don't focus on really anything else, any other committee, unless I've sponsored personally a bill on that committee. So we focus our time and our energy. But I know members serve on multiple standing committees in the 2 other states, and I wonder how that impacts the work product.
It's tough to sometimes juggle all those things, right? So I chair the General Laws Committee, but also sit on Ag and Natural Resources, Education, and Appropriations, and then chair a subcommittee in Appropriations. So it gets busy. It's neat because sometimes you get to go ahead and put more pieces to the puzzle together. You know, hard on appropriations sometimes, you know, if you have voted on the policy because you love the policy and then it comes over to appropriations and there's not enough money for it. So that's hard sometimes, you know, to say, hey, you know, we love the policy, but can't go ahead and move forward on that. I did want to mention the accessibility part, because in Virginia, and I don't know how this works in Pennsylvania or Maryland, but at least in the House side, bills can die in subcommittee. And so I know that there's other states, you know, where a subcommittee is just a recommendation. And it is just a recommendation in Virginia for a subcommittee, but by tradition, if you don't have the votes in subcommittee, it stays there in subcommittee. And I guess to Senator Alfrest's point, or maybe Senator Martin's point, you know, you can have a great idea, but you might just happen to hit the wrong subcommittee of, you know, 5 to 9 people, and your bill is gone. One of the things we have been working on to this slide's point is the public access part. And so it used to be that you could table a bill, and that's a non-recorded vote. And so we've done that now so that, you know, it is recorded if you table something, so you can see who was for or against something. And then, as awful as the pandemic has been, one of the things that it has forced us to do is better use technology to open up the process to residents of the Commonwealth. And so it used to be that in order to testify, you had to make that trip down to Richmond. You had your 5-minute say, and then you had to travel back home. And so we've equipped all of our subcommittees now with you know, online testifying capabilities, and that's something that we're going to keep even when we go back into regular session, doing that in person.
We have a lot of autonomy for our committees. Everybody says that, but when it comes to Chairman Bulba's point about being able to, we put it in the drawer, a bill, if it's not going to come for a vote. That's completely the prerogative of the chair. And some committees will put every bill that's in front of them up for an up or down vote. That's the style of that chairperson. And some committees really only put bills up for votes that they want to see move. And that's kind of an indication to the committee that the chair wants to see this move, but it's completely dependent committee to committee, which I can imagine is confusing for the public, that kind of lack of consistency between those committees.
I think I'll just say that it's interesting to talk about your focus being divided on serving on multiple different committees. I chair Senate Education, but sitting on a probes, environmental resources and energy, health and human services, judiciary. I mean, there's a whole line of them, and depending on what the issue is, it can definitely encompass your time, and so another issue gets put on the back burner. Now, the one positive I see about sometimes the number of committees we have. Give you an example. I remember for years we were working on DUI reform in Pennsylvania. I had a bill, and the judiciary chairman just was dead set about moving the bill. Well, we were able to kind of pull a fast one, and we actually were able to put the bill. We amended it into a bill in transportation, and we're able to accomplish the same thing. Now I think it's a little bit, though it's tough to do even within the Senate. It's even harder to do than if you want to go over to the House and try to get a certain bill. It may not. I don't know where else you would put the fertilizer bill that we sent over to the House outside of the Agriculture Committee. So we do try to play. I hate to call them those games, or shuffle the deck a little bit. But it depends on whether or not they're willing to play ball and go along with that without upsetting that chairman.
Okay, well, if they are willing to play ball and it gets through committee, it goes back to the full chamber. Here, again, the process, it has, between the three states, it has some differences, but it has these components. The parties caucus the bill. There are 3 readings or considerations at one point or another at different times during which amendments can be offered to the language of the bill. If it moves forward, there is a fiscal analysis that happens regarding the financial costs or implications of the bill, and then the proposed amendments. If it is voted on and passed through that chamber, it goes to the opposite chamber. And this process looks a whole lot like what it did in the originating chamber. If it gets amended in this opposite chamber, it goes back to the original chamber for consideration of the amendments. If the amendments are agreed to, it goes to the governor. If the amendments are not agreed to, then a conference committee consisting of members of both chambers is formed to try to work out the differences. And if the committee can come up with an agreement that both chambers agree to, it passes through both chambers, and then it goes to the governor for signing. The governor may sign the bill, veto the bill, or take no action, in which case the bill becomes law without the governor's signature. In Maryland, to override a veto, it's 3/5 of both chambers. In Virginia, it's 2/3, and the same thing with Pennsylvania, it's 2/3. A very brief segue about governors. Maryland, governors are limited to 2 4-year terms. Governor Hogan is in his 2nd term. The next election for governor is in 2022. So Hogan will be replaced. A new governor will be elected in 2022. In Pennsylvania, governors may serve 2 4-year consecutive terms. They can come back after a break. Governor Wolf is in his 2nd term. So same thing in Pennsylvania. The next gubernatorial election is in 2022. Virginia governors are limited to 1 4-year term, but can come back after a break. So we're seeing Terry McAuliffe attempt that process right now. So Governor Northam the next election in Virginia is in 2021, this upcoming fall. So there will be a new governor elected to Virginia this fall. If it goes to the governor and it is signed, congratulations, you have a law. For the sake of time, I am going to skip this discussion section because we had the discussion during that section. But panelists, if there's anything that we didn't get to talk about that process, let's talk about it when we get to the end times for questions, because I want to make sure that we at least touch on the budget process for each state. Now, I purposely left this section short because if we went into detail about the budget process, it would eat the entire hour and a half that we have here together. But I'm going to run through some interesting things so that you all can take them with you and come back and learn more about the interesting, processes that you hear about today. So kind of like the legislative cycle, the budget cycle in each state has the same bones. There is formulation of the budget, there is enactment of the budget, and there is execution of the budget. Length of these budget cycles. In Maryland and Pennsylvania, a new budget is passed every year. In Virginia, it is passed on a 2-year cycle. It's passed on even years during that longer day session that we talked about earlier. This doesn't mean that the budget isn't reviewed annually in Virginia, but it does mean that the formal process only occurs every other year. This is what the process looks like in a nutshell. Budget instructions are issued, state agencies review those instructions and submit budget requests to the governor. The governor prepares the budget and then presents it to the General Assembly. The budget goes through the legislative process in the General Assembly that we just looked at, and then it heads back to the governor for signing, except for in Maryland. So, some things to note about each state. The budget begins with the governor in all 3 states, but in Maryland, the legislature may not amend to increase the budget allowed to the executive branch departments or agencies, or transfer funds from one department to another, or from one program to another within a department or agency. The legislature's main power with the budget bill is to reduce or delete appropriations proposed in that bill. Now there are, and Senator Elfreth, I'm sure, can go into detail about how the legislature works around this limitation. But for time's sake, I'm going to move on right now, and I would like to invite her to speak about it in a little while. The governor does not, the governor proposes the bill and gives it to the General Assembly, but the governor does not get it back at the end of the day. So once it is passed by the General Assembly, it becomes the budget. The governor does not get to veto or amend it after the fact. And then I just wanted to mention the capital budget and bond bill. This is a supplementary appropriation bill, and I want you all to have heard the name because this is where the bulk of projects that contribute to bay restoration are funded. So if you are looking for best bay restoration funded projects in Maryland, the capital budget bond bill is what you want to focus on. Pennsylvania. I know that Senator Martin mentioned this earlier on in the conversation, but when we talk about water quality spending in Pennsylvania, it's statewide, not Bay watershed, not Chesapeake Bay watershed specific. So anything that we want to spend money on in Pennsylvania that is Bay related, we really need to multiply it by 3 so that we can cover the entirety of the state, not just the middle third of it when it comes to, everybody in Pennsylvania deserves clean water and healthy communities. The other thing that I wanted to just highlight in Pennsylvania is that there are 2 budgets per session instead of 1, right? So you have a 2-year legislative session, and during that legislative session, there are 2 separate budgets that are passed, 1 each year. And then for Virginia, so for Virginia, it's the opposite. They are on an annual legislative session, but their budget is passed on a biennial basis. The budget is passed on even numbered years. So although it's an every other year process, again, the governor can present amendments as needed to the legislature on those odd years, depending on what the state of the state is. Because it is a short session that they are focusing on, or that they have in Virginia, any bills regarding revenue have to be decided early. The governor is limited to 1 4-year term, and he or she cannot succeed themselves, right? So if you think about when the budget is passed and when a new election cycle for governor happens, the new governor is stuck with the budget that was proposed by the former governor for the first 2 years of his or her term. And then they get to decide the budget for the second 2 years of his or her 4-year term. And then they get to propose a budget for the next 2 years of the incoming governor's 4-year term. And that is significant to me as a layperson, but I would love to hear from Chairman Bulova about whether or not that makes any sort of difference in the long run. And with that, we have our discussion section for the budget, but we are also at the end of our presentation. So I would open up the conversation to our panelists to not only discuss what we just talked about, we just ran through in that quick budget overview, but also if you have takeaways, comments. I know we had some questions come in from the audience during the course of the presentation and some that came in beforehand. So I'd like to open it back up to the panelists.
So I want to hear from Senator Elfreth about the budget stuff and how that happens with the governor, because that perplexes me a little bit in terms of how that's done and why it was done that way.
Yeah, we have the strongest governor in the country because we can only move money around slightly, but not between departments or really between line items. So it really does tie our hands as a legislature. It dates back all the way about 100 years back. We, in 2 years, will have changed that. We passed a constitutional amendment just last year to allow us as a General Assembly to move money around, to not increase the budget. We still have to have a balanced budget every year. We all have to do. But we're going to have a little more flexibility in the budget starting in fiscal year 24, calendar year 23. So that's going to be an exciting time. But our response to not having as much impact on the budget has been to mandate funding. So the interplay between legislation and the budget is very interesting. The budget is introduced as a piece of legislation to go into effect July 1, the beginning of the fiscal year. But if we pass any legislation that has any funding attached to it, we cannot mandate funding for that next fiscal year. We have to put it in the following fiscal year. So there's always a 1-year delay in terms of execution and implementation of legislation that has a fiscal note. And that is really difficult, I think, in terms of executing some of our priorities. I think that's maybe the biggest issue. I think for all three of us, we have the commonality of we can only spend the money that we have. We're not Congress. We can't print our own money. And so that really does inhibit a lot of our priorities and values, particularly as Bay-focused legislators, to want to invest as much money into solving this problem. Our hands are tied with having to balance the budget with as many other priorities that are equally important, like education and safety and things like that. But in Maryland, we've gotten around it with mandating. Other fun note, though, even if we move money around slightly as we have, we call it fencing it off. The governor has complete autonomy in whether to actually spend that money or not. So there have been years where we fenced off some money for particular programs, in my district included, and the governor chose to not spend that money, and it just sat in the general fund until the following fiscal year. So our hands are really tied until fiscal year 24.
Great. And before we, I guess, keep going with our takeaways and questions, I think our formal end time for our presentation was going to be 2:30. We did anticipate that if the questions were going well, and I think that there's a good number of them out there, that all of our presenters and Molly are available for another 15 minutes or so. And so if people have to drop off, thank you so much for joining us. But if you'd like to stick around for another 15 minutes, we'll try to squeeze in as many questions as humanly possible. I will build a little bit on Molly's point, the kind of the oddity in Virginia where you have the outgoing governor introducing the budget bill for basically the incoming governor and a new General Assembly. And so, you know, depending on how things are going, that can either be a smooth transition, or if you have two governors, an outgoing and an incoming one with different perspectives, it can leave the new governor really kind of scrambling to figure out what their priorities are and what they might want to see as amendments from the General Assembly. But I guess kind of the opposite of what Senator Elfreth was saying, it does put a lot of power as the institutional memory on the state legislature, because we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. And we've got an institutional memory, whereas that first year, the governor, is not only trying to get their team in place, but they're also having to deal with the fact that they're going to have to look at their budget priorities versus what the former governor put in. And so it does give that governor really kind of one opportunity to have a fresh budget during their 4-year cycle go to the General Assembly. And so that is really, really important, in terms of putting their fingerprint on the budget process. I'll also mention, because Senator Elfreth had mentioned the fact that all of our state constitutions require that we balance our budget. And so I think that's something very different, from the federal level. An interesting thing with respect to the pandemic is, in Virginia, we were anticipating a revenue loss of about $2.4 billion this time last year. And so we not only had to unallot a lot of our new funding, but we had to really kind of clean house and figure out what it was that we wanted to go ahead and cut. I think what was the interesting outcome of that, as revenue started to come back in, is that it gave us a chance to really reprioritize our spending in a way that we had never done before, right? Because we had to go ahead and cut back. But the expectation wasn't that we were just going to put that funding back in just like it had been. Now was a chance to look at what are our real priorities. And in the case of Virginia, I was very glad that resulted in some pretty big investments in water quality, especially Chesapeake Bay restoration. So as a result of that process, we were able to put in about $150 million more into the Chesapeake Bay than what we had, even a year before.
I find it interesting, the one-term governor. You figure how long, your amount of time to look under the hood and figure out processes. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the one-term thing. I know Senator Ellsworth brought up about not spending money that was allocated by the General Assembly. It goes both ways. One of our big battles is called supplemental spending, and that's the governor spending well beyond what we allocated, because he sees the revenue projections that come in too. But that basically gives him the ability to go ahead and spend the money on things that may not be, the consensus thing to spend money on. It might just be his personal thing that he wants to fund. So I'm seeing a lot, not only here, but interesting to see across the country, where you have these kind of disagreements on how things are done or about gubernatorial power. A lot of people are turning towards amending their constitutions and things. And I know we just did it with emergency powers yesterday, and the people voted for it in Pennsylvania. But then we're also have bills related to containing supplemental spending. And people are looking, if we can't get it, face it, if he put the bill on the governor's desk, he's going to veto that. So people are turning to the electoral process through changing the Constitution through the people in order to put in the guardrails necessary in order to try to constrain things or maybe equal the branches of government in terms of their role and say. So it'll be interesting to see if that dynamic catches more in different places too, where it's allowed to happen.
Yeah. So there was a really good question in the chat dealing with what kind of staff resources each of us have as members of our respective general assemblies. And so I think, first of all, one of the great things about being on the Chesapeake Bay Commission is that we have fantastic staff, and each state has a Chesapeake Bay Commission liaison that works with us in order to be able to put together legislation, put together budget amendments, track the legislative and policy process. And so that's very valuable. But in terms of our other staff, I'm curious from Senator Martin and Senator Ellsworth, who do you have working with you? And so in Virginia, by and large, each member has one full-time legislative staff to answer constituent questions or to do research. And then if you are a committee chair, you generally have a clerk during the session, as well as legislative staff and an attorney to help you deal with putting together legislation. But by and large, you get that one person to handle all of that kind of constituent stuff. And I think the same thing in Maryland, and maybe Scott, you can talk about it in Pennsylvania, is, we're decidedly part-time in Virginia. And so, more often than not, it's that legislative assistant that's going to be the front person in our offices, trying to deal with those constituent issues.
Yeah, well, first, the Senate side has more staffing support than the House does in Pennsylvania. Obviously, we have larger districts. Like I mentioned earlier, I have some members who have four counties in their senatorial district. And so if they have district offices in different places to assist people, they kind of spread it out. For me, I have a chief of staff I have a legislative person that helps write the bills with me and does a lot of the legwork with that. The committee, being a chairman, there is an executive, and it's interesting, the Senate just changed this for this session. They wanted to move to a model where there's some longevity and institutional history. And so we have an executive director of each of the committees, and now those people are going to stay there. In the past, it would have been my legislative director would have served in that role, but they're going to have these EDs in place. And if I'm not chairing education next time, that person, that's ED, is staying there for the next chairman. So you have that continuity. Back in the district, I have two folks who work with constituent services. And so I think a total of 6 overall, split up between the district and up in Harrisburg in the Senate.
I think people think we're a congressional office and that we have about 10 staff. I have 1 full-time, I have 1 part-time, and I have 1 kind of part-time, but we have a wonderful nonpartisan Department of Legislative Services staff, and I chair a subcommittee, so I have a dedicated person on pensions, for instance, who will answer my pension questions late at night. But we are very, very small here in Maryland as well, and the difference between the House and the Senate. I will say, just as a modern legislator, I think the pressures from our constituents and the expectations for us to respond to every email within 24 hours, or to have someone constantly in the office answering the phone, we're getting to a point where I think we are going to need to think about expanding staff, just because we want to provide that quality constituent services, but we run our staff ragged, and they don't get paid a whole lot, and they are doing it because they believe in public service. But I think we're going to get to a point soon where we're going to have to increase staff to make sure we're serving the public well.
Yeah. So we were talking about the difference between the federal and state levels, because often people don't think about the differences between those. And so we talked about, the state level, you have to balance your budget. I'm curious whether Pennsylvania and Maryland also have what's called the one object rule. And so in Virginia, we don't have these big omnibus pieces of legislation like you imagine at the federal level. Everything has to deal with one object, which is great because it means most pieces of legislation are 1 paragraph, 1 or 2 pages at the most, although there's exceptions out there, but it keeps things relatively short and succinct. And it also protects you from people who are trying to maybe monkey around with your bill, right? And so if you get on the House floor and somebody puts in an amendment, that would change the nature of it, you violated the one object rule, or it becomes non-germane, and that amendment will go ahead and fail. And so people know better kind of what they're voting on, and that they're voting on a single thing rather than having to make hard choices when you've got things that are crammed into a single piece of legislation. So I'm curious how Maryland and Virginia or Pennsylvania do that.
Kind of, we call it single subject rule up here. So we do have omnibus bills. We had an omnibus climate bill this past year that had electrifying the state fleet, planting 5 million trees, larger greenhouse gas goals. And that bill crossed two committees on both the House and the Senate, which is part of the reason I think it didn't make it to the finish line this year when it's jointly assigned to multiple committees. So we do have omnibus bills, but we do have single subject and I actually got single subjected on a bill the last couple of days of session, and nothing gets you angrier than when someone calls the AG to single subject you. So you can't put it was a tax credit bill, and we tried to, related to the airport, we tried to put another issue related to the airport on that bill related to tax. I thought we were being creative and cute with taxes in the airport, but we got single subjected, so we couldn't put that amendment on that bill.
Yeah, we have a single subject rule also in Pennsylvania. And we're always, it's always a reminder, the attorneys that are up there will say if they think something may or may not be germane to what you're working on. There's certainly been plenty of cases here in Pennsylvania of certain bills struck down for violating that single subject rule. But I think for the most part, we do a pretty good job of trying to avoid those waters. When you do the budget, I think that's where the most flexibility is with the code bills that go along with it. There tends to be a lot of stuff, but there's an education code bill, so it all has to be germane to that, or your tax code bill, whatever it might be. So, but definitely something we have to be sure not to, because as my colleague from Maryland said too, very quickly someone will challenge that in legal fashion and more than likely get it struck down.
So I guess an interesting distinction maybe between or among our three different approaches, because I think I heard you say that there was a third party who rules on whether something violates that single subject rule. And I think Senator Elfreth mentioned the Attorney General. And so we don't have anything like that in Virginia. It's basically the speaker makes that determination. So it sounds to me like you've got an outside entity that calls balls and strikes on that, and that probably makes a difference.
Molly, it looks like you're kindly putting questions in the chat. I can try to take a stab at the question of how to motivate one another. And I appreciate that word instead of pressure one another. How do we motivate one another? And, you know, I would love to see our executives really get together a little more often, and they do certainly, but try to solve these problems at the executive level. We are certainly doing it at the legislative level and exchanging ideas. And you'll often see Virginia pass a piece of legislation one year, and then Pennsylvania and Maryland will pick it up and be influenced and motivated by that. And so that's the whole purpose of the Bay Commission, is for us as policymakers to motivate one another. But I think there's no limit to how well or how much energy we can spend in doing that. You know, in my district, it's all coming down river, and the watershed isn't recognizing these arbitrary political boundaries between counties and states. And so we really do have to focus harder, stop pointing as many fingers and throwing as many bombs, and frankly, get into rooms, perhaps over an alcoholic beverage, and try to work out these challenges that are shared amongst us.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with Senator Elfreth. And you know, I'd be interested in Senator Martin's perspective on that, including the evening beverage solution to fostering conversation. But let's face it, anytime that you're dealing with, you know, interjurisdictional issues of this magnitude, it's not going to be easy. You know, you've got three very different states with different, you know, revenue sources, and you know, they're all struggling to go ahead and do the right thing. And I think the beauty of the commission and why it's so important is, you know, number one, it makes sure that we're on the same page with respect to the science. You know, so each of us, you know, a good part of our commission meetings is just, you know, the foundational parts of why are we doing this? What is the science showing? So that we can agree on the premise of where we're starting. You know, and then it's the policy development part, you know, and, you know, realizing that we're not going to tackle it in all the same way, but having that resource to, you know, be able to develop policies and legislative approaches and budget. And then, as, you know, Senator Elfreth said, you know, a good part of this is just keeping up those human lines of communication, you know, realizing we're all people working as hard as we can for our constituents, you know, who all believe in restoring the Chesapeake Bay. And we feed off of each other, and, you know, we have those healthy conversations, but we all realize and recognize that, you know, we're all on the same page with respect to what we're doing, and we can never lose sight of that.
No, I couldn't agree more. You know, there's that old adage, you attract more bees with sugar than you do with vinegar. And, you know, sometimes, you know, I find when you take the time to hear someone else's perspective or what's motivating them to believe what they believe, or quite frankly, how it's best serving their constituents. You know, we all come from different areas or different experiences. And I think that's all healthy in terms of that understanding and a better process. I think too much in politics these days, there's way too much bomb throwing, not enough communicating, not enough trying to understand. But I do believe there's a lot of good people who aren't on the fringe, who are more interested in being problem solvers. And problem solving takes understanding the problem you're dealing with and understanding why someone thinks a certain type of solution should have. So that's one thing I love about the Bay Commission. I don't think I've ever walked into it once in my time here and sensed, you know, Republican or Democrat or whatever. I've seen people who care about what the mission of the organization is, no matter what their political stripe is. And that's why they're there. I imagine they wouldn't be there if they did it. And so it's been a pleasure working with all of them, but it's also great to see how many other people, even in Pennsylvania, are starting to understand and listen and come up with solutions. So hopefully it's something that fire will keep growing.
Great. And I think with that, I can't think of a better way to wrap up today's session than the answers to that question. And so I just want to give a heartfelt thanks to Molly Brown for putting this presentation together and doing such a great job of walking us through a very complicated topic. But I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as we all did. Want to thank Senator Martin for facilitating and putting on the Pennsylvania hat in the discussions, as well as Senator Elfreth for being there to provide a Maryland view. I want to thank all the commission staff behind the scenes who worked very hard to pull all this together. And most of all, I want to thank our participants. I just, the fact that we were able to get, almost 100 people online who are committed to the Chesapeake Bay and wanted to learn more. That is what's going to get us across the finish line to meet our Chesapeake Bay cleanup targets and allow us to be able to restore one of this nation's just absolute treasures. So with that, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Do not hesitate to follow up with our commission staff, with our Executive Director, Ann Swanson. And again, we'll be sending out the cheat sheets after the presentation. And with that, thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.